introduce me anytime. I'm ready.
Hey, Doc, we're ready too. Can you hear me good?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Again. Very good. Thank you, sir. How are you, sir? Dr.
Doing well.
Ade. Good to
I'm
see you,
ready.
sir.
No, good to be here. Ready to go.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes, sir. I'm ready whenever you're ready.
Oh, hello. I don't know if anybody could see me, but I am Dr. Jabali Ade, blessed to be a member of the Department of Africology and African American Studies here at Temple University. And I'm here to welcome you all to the annual Africology at Temple Afrocentric Lecture, sponsored by the undergraduate and graduate associations of the department and supported by Afrocentric Circle study groups in many universities, both here in Philadelphia and in other nations throughout the world. Our talk today will be given by Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, professor and chair of the Department of Africology and African American Studies here at Temple University, one of the 10 most quoted African thinkers. Asante is the author of 96 books, including his latest work, Being Human Being, Transforming the Race Discourse, written in cooperation with our very own Dr. Na Dove. Today, Dr. Asante seeks to raise questions around illusions and delusions in an effort to clarify the Afrocentric objective of Ma'at as a core to human society. All questions will be put in the chat, and we will have time to answer a few of these questions after the lecture. Thank you for attending. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Molefi Kete Asante.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ade. I'm delighted to be here. I honor the ancestors. I sing Oriki and Ezebongo to all of them. I have spoken on decolonizing education in several venues in the world, in Australia, South America, Russia, the UK, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Japan, China, Canada, and of course, the USA, where the owners of the land completely lost their continent and their culture. It is always true that the worst loss is always to lose one's mind. I do not speak today of decolonizing or decoloniality because I work at freeing myself from situating Europe in the middle of Africa's historical narrative. I've urged others in the world to recenter themselves so that the narratives they tell minimize the role played by invaders and intruders. The European experience in Africa, for example, the home of Homo sapiens, is a small dot on the broad plane of 300,000 years of humanity. Most of that time, nearly 3/4 of that time spent on the continent of Africa. We should not periodize our history by the coming of the Europeans. We should understand that the processes of history, particularly when it involves invasions and intrusions into cultures, we understand domination, the notion of hierarchy, the bringing of patriarchy, and the bringing also of what has been called racism. We will have a conversation about that a little later. But this lecture today, this annual Afrocentric lecture, the inaugural one, and I really appreciate my faculty, my students for allowing me to at least say a few words today on this inaugural lecture, is really intended to refocus intellectual discourse in the way that we see humanity, because we have always argued as Afrocentrists that there is only one race, and it's Homo sapiens, and that Homo sapiens were originated on the continent of Africa. Homo sapiens developed the first civilizations on the continent of Africa, and Homo sapiens developed human values on the continent of Africa. So this is all important for us to understand, that this is the very basis of our tradition, the very basis of our appreciation for ourselves and for others. But I have always thought that our ancestors, even in North America, as well as certainly around the world, have often bent like the palm trees of the tropics, but have always returned to strength. But I would like this day to lay something very heavy on you so that we take up the task for which we have been prepared. My topic, you have seen it announced, is about many things, but it's about illusions. It's about delusions. And the idea of illusions and delusions have come to me simply because when I try to assess the reality of today's world in terms of the spread of the doctrine of white supremacy, I see a lot of delusion. And I think that for some of us, there may be illusions. Illusion is a thing that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived or interpreted by the senses. You know, sometimes we say there's an optical illusion, caused by atmospheric conditions. Sometimes people see the appearance of a sheet of water in a desert, and they think it's water, but it's not water, you see? That's an illusion. And there are four types of illusions. There are tactical illusions based on touch. There are optical illusions based on sight, auditory illusions based on what we hear, what we think we hear, and there are certainly cognitive illusions. It is something that is not as it appears. And that's why I think that part of what we're dealing with, when we are dealing with the problems of the doctrine of white supremacy in knowledge and information, we now like to talk about epistemologies of the South, for example. The reason we talk like that is because we are aware of the doctrine of white supremacy that has basically dominated all Western education. But the real issue is that these cognitive illusions also lead to delusions. And a delusion is a belief or an imaginative idea that is firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what is generally accepted as fact or reality. And this is, some people say it's a sign of mental illness. I wouldn't go that far. I would just say that it's certainly on the road to someone being disassociated from what is real. And I want to state two main propositions for this little talk today. One is that the structure of education, particularly for African people, in wherever we are, whether we're in Brazil, as many of you may be, whether we are in Colombia, in South America as well, or whether we are in Lagos, Nairobi, or Cape Town, or Shawani, whether we're in Miami or Boston or Los Angeles or London, or right here in Philadelphia, where I am. The structure of our education has been corrupted by the doctrine of white supremacy. And that is a real problem. And it is a problem that leads to delusions, and particularly on the part of people who consider themselves whites. Second proposition is that the African people must completely break free from the encapsulating, stifling, and culturally demeaning educational curricula disseminated around the world by the Pan-European Academy. Even that academy that disseminates this doctrine even to African universities. I've been to many, many African universities, and I see the same Pan-European Academy that I could see anywhere else in the Western world. And it's many times that academy does not relate to what is actually happening in the African context. So once we have transformed ourselves in a way that we can understand the human discourse and the necessity that we get back to understanding how African people who were the first Homo sapiens and the only Homo sapiens for nearly 230,000 years, how African people saw Ma'at, the concept of harmony and balance and order and justice, truth and righteousness. Until we get back to something like that, we cannot even reestablish the radically new African episteme. And I think that is essential, particularly for a world that has gone so wrong by virtue of Europe's domination. Therefore, I want to situate the construction of education, the construction of curricula itself in an affirming African praxis within the broader structural response to what I call a lingering domination model of education. Even on the continent of Africa, we have often used the colonial curriculum model even after independence of many of all the countries now on that continent. So what that means is that we inherited, as we have in the United States and as we have in Canada and in the UK and in Brazil, we have inherited from white supremacist ideologies the notion of a hierarchy of what we call even the hierarchy of everything, the hierarchy of humanities, social sciences, and the sciences. The divisions themselves are to be severely questioned in the Afrocentric canon. Because when we look at the Afrocentric canon, we go back to asking the questions about humanity and not about a particular race of people. It is a totally anti-racist position that we have to take. So my talk challenges the necessity for continuing the building of curriculum along the matrix of race, even along the matrix of race, gender, class, sexuality, age, ability, religion, territory, nationality, and the endless imbricated systems of classification that reproduce prevailing structures of power. I know that's a big thing. Let me just break this down for you. That the Afrocentric discourse, the Afrocentric assertion of values challenges the necessity for intersectionality. It challenges the necessity for us to break human beings into races or genders or classes, sexuality, ages, et cetera, et cetera. And really, because in the end, as Dr. Nadav and I have said in our book, Being Human Being, Transforming the Race Discourse, in the end, what we assert is humanity. And we assert that as the objective of the Afrocentric position that moves us into the realm of looking at what the very earliest African civilizations saw the people along the Nile Valley and how they viewed humanity. They saw differences, but they did not rank differences. This is the difference between what Europe did. The Africans knew that there were people who were lighter and darker and shorter and taller, and they recognized that. And they've already recognized that people heard different languages. But even so, it's the classification by ranking, or the ranking in order to classify, that created what we have now with this whole doctrine of white racial supremacy, which has dominated all thinking in Europe and most of the thinking that I've run into in the United States of America. That is what has to be dismantled. Not merely the dismantling of race as a cultural construct, but dismantling the racial ladder itself, this hierarchical notion that whites are at the top and that blacks are at the bottom. It is that that has to be destroyed. And I think that that is what most of us who have taken on the epistemology of truth have committed ourselves to do. So we're talking about something that's different and radically different. In this sense, at stake is much more than a narrative dispute within or beyond the walls of the Eurocentric Academy. We are talking about the necessity to mark silences, to mark erasures, and the unnegotiable recognition of our equal humanities and humanness, the necessity to recenter and redefine the terms of our conversations, and the necessity to work transversally against the compartmentalization of special topics and areas, so as to make these questions undeniable, irrelevant to the African project, which I think is central to the world objective of humanization and liberalization. There's some facts which must be faced, must be reflected upon and understood for us to correct the path. And I say honestly that we can do this. I believe we can do this. I think Afrocentrists in their research and analysis have shown that this is possible. Take some examples from American history as instructive, and I'll give you three, and then we can even talk about more. But I choose to speak of these three because they have come to my attention recently through my own reading. First, when the Europeans arrived in America and New England, what was named New England by the Europeans, it was certainly not named that by the people who were already there. Those people called their land something like the Dawn land, the land of the rising sun. So that was what they called it. When the Europeans got there, they said, "Oh, we're from England, so we're going to call this New England." You see, this again domination. The whole idea that you come into somebody's land and you assume that you can then redefine and dominate that territory. That's precisely the first crime against the indigenous people, the people who are already here when the Europeans arrived. Because when they got here, they found here human beings living their lives, raising their families. It was not long before edicts were passed and given to white settlers that allowed them to go into the countryside to kill, to slaughter the indigenous people, the Penobscot and Wabanaki people, scalping them in order to take their territory. If you bring me so many scalps of indigenous people, you can get so many acres of land. That was the bargain that was often made. Hundreds of these edicts were given by the white settlers when they came into a territory to encourage white people to go out and take the land of people. This was not just done in North America. I mean, I was traveling some years ago in Argentina and discovered that the same thing happened to the indigenous people in the south of Argentina, Terra del Fuego. It's the same sort of thing, this idea of going out into the countryside, killing native people, and then taking their land. That happened in the United States of America as well. And this is part of why there is this big outcry now on the parts of some people of European descent about what they call this critical race theory, I guess, this whole idea of saying, let's look at the history, the history that has been taught in the United States and raise questions about it and say, okay, this is the way it was, but now let's correct this and let's move on in a more positive way. But there are people who don't even want you to raise the questions, but the questions have to be raised because when you start looking at the text and you look at the edicts, the laws that are available to look at, for example, in New England, you see these edicts that are calling for the scalping of indigenous people. So what is this about? What are these hundreds of edicts that were given by the settlers? What does this mean? What does this mean when the people who themselves say they are Christians who are coming and yet they accept these edicts as a way to go out and in their judgment and their understanding of the time to destroy what they call heathens? If people were considered heathens, then they said, well, then it was all right to do this. I mean, what God would give people the right to do that? But that's what they believed. They accepted that belief. This was, they believed that that they could do this and that this was correct. And yet, if you ask most white Americans, they believed that it was the Indians who were responsible for starting scalping, that the Indians scalped whites. And in fact, all of the films, many of the films, the old films about Native Americans, you would have them scalping white people. But who brought that technique, that tactic to North America? If you go back and you look at the earliest documents of the settlers coming from Europe, that is precisely their pattern and not the pattern of the native peoples. So when we get ready for what they call Thanksgiving, remember that the native people were people who, in fact, were really massacred very early on in order for their land to be taken. Now, the second one is similarly strange, and it is the often heard shout, "Remember the Alamo," as a war cry. And many older people have seen what they call the John Wayne movies of the white Americans defending the Alamo. But it's a delusion because the Alamo was number one in Mexico. Texas was part of Mexico. And in fact, Mexico lost half of its territory as a result of a war with the United States. And that war was precipitated by many of the things that happened in Texas. And the principal thing was the defeat of the white settlers who had basically squatted inside of the territory of Mexico. And they had squatted there for a purpose. And the purpose was to expand cotton production and to bring slavery into Texas. That was the reason that the whites were in Texas. They were not in Texas for no reason. They were in Texas, actually, to be able to expand the territory where Africans could be enslaved and they could make more money on the lands of the Comanche people and the territory that was controlled by Mexico. But when one starts to study this, you can begin to see it. Stephen Austin was a huge slaver. He basically controlled many Africans. He was deeply involved in trying to bring Africans from Louisiana and other states into Texas in order to start a big cotton business. But in 1829, Mexico had outlawed slavery. And the person who was responsible for making certain that it was outlawed was an African by the name of Vicente Guerrero. And Guerrero was the first president of Mexico, and in fact, of African descent. And so I always say that Obama may have been the second of North America, but the first was Vicente Guerrero. And he outlawed slavery. Mexico passed that law, and yet the Americans, the white Americans, went into San Antonio and took over the Alamo, and they were trying to claim Texas for themselves so that they could, of course, have slavery. And that's why the government of Mexico and Mexico City decided to send Santa Anna, General Santa Anna, across the river in order to bring the territory back under the control of Mexico. This is extremely important. So it's not so much remember the Alamo as to really forget the Alamo, because the Alamo really was a symbol of enslavement. And in fact, according to some historians, Santa Anna wrote in his diary that they were going to punish the whites for bringing slavery into their territory. Otherwise, if you believe something different, it's a delusion. The third example, this is an example which in American history, we rarely talk about. But it's the fact that if you live in America as an African person, you're often affected by the same domination, white domination, white racial supremacy doctrine. It affects everything. It touches everything. It is a virus, and it's bad. It's dangerous to your thinking, to your cognitive ability. And I was thinking of the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers who came out of the Civil War, having fought valiantly for the freedom of African people who had been enslaved, were sent after the war, were sent to the West to chase Geronimo and Cochise, two leaders of the Apache people. And so that this history of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Africans who were called Buffalo Soldiers, that the history of these soldiers really now is also is troubled by this notion of being at the service of the doctrine of white supremacy and the expansion of white people, basically, into the western part of the country. Along with that, I mean, I can always think of the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the biggest promoters of Mahatma Gandhi. To give Gandhi credit for his notion of nonviolence. And yet, of course, King did not know that Gandhi considered the Africans in South Africa savages and primitives and not equal to the Indians in South Africa. I mean, in fact, Gandhi was a very big racist, and a very big racist even against many of the Indian people in India, particularly the Sudras and the Dalits. But that's another question. But I'm just saying that all of this is affected, I believe, by the doctrine of white supremacy. Now, how do we start to dismantle this? First, I think Africans have to see that we are terrorized by the construction of knowledge imposed upon us during the European conquest and domination of African people from the 15th century. If we do not admit and understand this fact, we will be disinclined to emancipate ourselves and others from participating in the domination of the white world, its domination of us by the white world, this sort of crusade for economic, political, and social domination of the world. In fact, we've often been carriers of that ideology for too long, believing in the falsification of history promoted by major white intellectuals. It is no wonder that we bless and we honor John Henrik Clarke, the late African-American historian and cultural icon, who said that when Europe conquered territories, especially during the 18th and to the 20th centuries, the Europeans not only occupied the lands, but they also dominated information about the lands. And I always say they not only about the lands, but about the people. I mean, when the Europeans conquered the indigenous people of what is now New England and basically destroyed those people, they didn't just destroy them and take their land, they also wrote about who these people were and how these people received them, et cetera, et cetera. But all of this was, of course, to support the notion of white supremacy. It is this fact that I have learned to acknowledge and I've learned to combat in our institutions of higher learning. For some of us, this is scary since we have not been without Europeans legitimizing our knowledge or our status since the 16th century. We might feel lost without the Bible, without Jesus, without David Livingstone, without Muhammad, without David Hume, John Locke, Karl Marx. But I guarantee you, African people and other people, that nothing bad will happen to you if you forget all those thoughts and dig deep into your own historical narratives for knowledge and wisdom. After all, we have practiced knowledge longer than any people on the earth. Do you think that we had nothing of importance to teach about spirituality, creativity, family, geography, mathematics, geometry? When it was Africans who first named the stars. It was Africans who first gave names to the days of the week. It was Africans who created the calendar and gave meaningful names to children that reflected ancestors. What I call for, and I've called for this for now 40 years, and I've been credited with expounding the idea of Afrocentric knowledge, that is, knowledge that derives from narratives that center Africans as subjects of questions, and principles in history, and agents in all political, environmental, economic, cultural, and social actions, so that we can understand who we are and what gifts we bring to ourselves and to the world. And so what I've called for is that we not be marginalized, don't marginalize ourselves, but that we see ourselves as at the very beginning of human history. And our children do not so much have to go get knowledge, since they are born into a world of knowledge, often dismissed, often hidden, often erased, often eliminated by Eurocentrists, who may be white or Black. One does not have to be white to be a believer in the doctrine of white supremacy. There are thousands of Africans and Asians who are participating in the world of pan-European construction without realizing that they are burying their own ancestors. I personally, as you know, some of you, I have been influenced by many people Herbert Vilakazi, Archie Mafeji, J.A. Shofala, Steve Biko, Thabo Mbeki, Mangalizo Subukwe, Simpiwe Asante, Lahosa Malloy. I've read deeply in the works of other Africans like Chinwezu, Ayakwe Arma, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Maulana Karenga, Ivan Van Sertima, C.T. Kato, Amamazama, Danny Nabaderi, Winston Van Horn, and Marima Ani. I've even learned from those with whom I've debated, such as Cornel West, Henry Louis Gates, Kwame Jeche, Ifeanyi Menkiti, and Ali Mazrui. However, I was personally inspired by Sheikh Anta Diop, whom I traveled to meet in Dakar in 1980, and enthusiastically told him that I wanted to follow his path as an intellectual and defend Africa, whereupon he said to me, young man, Africa needs no defense. You must advance, always advance. At that point, there was nothing more for me to do than to interrogate every instance of African life, particularly as that life was encountered European life and understanding. And if the subject was time, I wanted to know how and why we created the first calendar along the Nile. If the subject was human anatomy, I wanted to discover how Africans mastered mummification and the biology of human beings. If the subject was literature, I wanted to go and see for myself the writing on the walls of the pyramids where Africans had written some of the earliest pyramid texts. I wanted to see that for myself. I wanted to see the papyrus for myself. I wanted to learn the language myself. I studied the language. I wanted to teach the language because I wanted to go back way before Greek was ever spoken. Thousands of years before Greek was spoken, we can see that African languages were at the very beginning, very heart of human civilization. So I want to just bring this. I'm gonna say a few more words and then bring this to it. And Carter Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Boy, it's getting to be a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, not quite 100 years, not really, but at least 90. He wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, and he said, if you went to school, you would never learn anything except the inferiority of Black people. And this is one of the things that we as students in the 1960s, certainly at the University of California, we knew this at UCLA, that if you went to school, and many of us older scholars went to universities in the 60s, partly as a response to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and the death of Malcolm X. Universities opened their doors to us, and we went in. But the one thing we saw very early on was you learn nothing except the inferiority of Black people. This is all they teach. What we saw was white studies everywhere. This was the real shocker to us, particularly in the South of the United States, where we had been in schools where people knew a little bit, but they knew enough to know that Africa was a home of civilization. Mr. Tharp, my 11th grade history teacher, knew that. He knew enough to understand that the Peras of ancient Kemet were Black people. He understood enough about Africa to know about Great Zimbabwe. So they knew about Mansa Musa. They had this knowledge, and they could teach us some things and give us inspiration. And this knowledge came to them sometimes piecemeal, but it came to them. But when we got to the universities, dominated by European thinkers and European teachers, There were no Black people in psychology in the textbooks. There were Black students, but there were no Black people in the textbooks. There were no Black theorists. There were no Black scholars or philosophers in political science that they exposed us to. We were not exposed in sociology to great Black thinkers about transformation of societies. We were in classes and subjects and fields in education. And in those days, we didn't learn about the men and women who basically taught the world from Wasset. We didn't know about that. They didn't open that door. When I took Greek classes with Prentice Mehta at UCLA, and he talked about the Greek miracle, he didn't know anything about Africa, and he admitted it. When I questioned A.J. Ayres, the outstanding British philosopher, about African philosophy, he admitted publicly, "Young man, I know nothing of African philosophy." This is what African-American students immediately found and discovered. And that's why Black studies became the cry of the students. Because we remembered what Carter Woodson said. He said, "You would never thereby learn that Africans first domesticated the sheep, the goat, and the cow. That Africans developed the idea of trial by jury. That Africans produced the first stringed elements, or rather instruments, and gave the world its greatest boon in the discovery of iron. You would never learn that if you went to school in America or in colonial Africa, you see." Sheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, our greatest intellectual of the 20th century, wrote, "The future of Blacks all over the world is interconnected. Black people must find a way to articulate this historic unity." Wade Nobles, the preeminent African psychologist in America, wrote in Kemet and the African Worldview that the political control of knowledge is the necessary condition for white supremacy. The political control of knowledge is the necessary condition for white supremacy. Maulana Karenga, founder of Kwanzaa, wrote in Introduction to Black Studies that the task of the Black scholar must be to rescue and reconstruct Black history as well as humanity. And I think that they were all in line with Steve Bantu Biko, the father of Black consciousness movement, when he wrote in I Write What I Like, "We are aware of the terrible role played by our education and religion in creating amongst us a false understanding of ourselves." These are conclusions of great African intellectuals. And these statements are profound, you see, in terms of our mental emancipation and in terms of what we assert as human beings. And I just want to cite Chinwezu, the Nigerian philosopher, one of my friends, who said that our challenge is to bring our people to the point where they automatically question the opinion of enemy experts. Why should we assume that the enemies of Africa, those who placed Africa at the bottom of the racial ladder, will liberate Africans intellectually when their goal is to make Africans Europeans in everything but color? So we asked this question, and I asked you this question about education. Who is older, the Greeks or the Egyptians? You know the answer. So then why do we start with Houma instead of the pyramids? The pyramids are the most foundational objects of human knowledge anywhere in the world. It's not Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. You know, one shouldn't start discussion of knowledge there. Start the discussion of knowledge at 2700 BC, not at 800 BC, 2700 BC. The building of the pyramids. There's nothing in antiquity greater, more profound, more foundational to human knowledge than the people who came up with the geometry and literature and mummification, meaning chemistry and anatomy, the study of the human body, and, physical body. I mean, there's nothing greater than that. That's the very beginning. No intellectual in the ancient world should be before Imhotep. Not just the father of medicine, who was worshipped as a deity, but also a mathematician, the builder of the first pyramid, a singer of poems. And yet, most people have never heard the name Imhotep. So I don't begin anything with Houma. I think Houma did the right thing when he said that the greatest, the most handsome, the best people were in Africa. So we learning from white supremacists, that Africa should be hated in its originality. Many Africans despise the ways of our ancestors without ever interrogating them, because we had only heard that from white people. We hated our bodies as seen in relationship to white bodies. We despise the beautiful ways that we decorated our bodies with colors and textures, and preferred other styles of those who had conquered us. In effect, we became misaligned with our own history, with our own culture, our ultimate beingness. This was not our choice. We were forced into it, believing that modernity had something to do with whiteness. And in fact, actually, there wouldn't be any modernity without Africans. When Thomas Macaulay spoke of the colonized Indians, he envisioned creating a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Why are we trapped in this cocoon? I think the tragedy is that some of us do not even know that it's a cocoon. Harriet Tubman, the greatest figure in African-American history, was credited with rescuing hundreds of people from enslavement. But when some people said to her, Miss Tubman, "You are the epitome of courage and ingenuity," she said to them, "It is true that I have rescued 1,000 from slavery, but I could have rescued thousands more if they only knew they were enslaved." As it is with our many academics that I know, we do not know that we have been boxed into a Eurocentric framework that desacralizes our ancestors while it venerates Europe in our brain. That is the problem. This is why I say the university is the keeper, alongside religion, of this notion of dominance, asserting delusional and illusional materials, maintaining the structures of legitimacy, and handing out prizes to those of us who best fit the model of Europe. Transformation is not only possible, it is essential to our psychological and cultural health. So in conclusion, in this first lecture, certainly there's far more to say and far more to do. I just want to say to you that the dismantling of the racial ladder is our first step. It is the confrontation of all forms of discrimination, all forms of persecution, and all forms of the attempt to inferiorize people by what is called ethnicity or class or race or gender or sexuality. We have to assert more vigorously than ever that there's one humanity, Homo sapiens, and that the aim of Homo sapiens from the very beginning of civilization was to arrive at the point of ma'aticity. And ma'aticity meant that you work toward truth, righteousness, justice, order, harmony, balance, reciprocity. If we do these things, if we follow this path, then I am certain that all of us will one day be happy to rejoice and appreciate that regardless of where we have come from, in whatever land or country we are, whether we're Africans in Mexico or Africans in Puerto Rico or wherever, that we are, we understand that it is the naming of our ancestors in our children that help us to maintain our dignity and our sensibility, our rationality, you see, because to lose your mind is the worst thing that you can lose. Thank you very much. Asante sana.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. At this time, we will take questions from the attendees, from the audience. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand and we can.
We have about time for two questions, but I don't see anything in the chat. Do you? If we don't have any chats, it is still good. I see one, let me see. Oh.
You have one. Can you hear me, Dr. Asante?
Okay, yes, I see, and I see the question. This is a good question. Arlene Holt, Egyptians today reject the idea of African. They appear more aligned with European ideas and hierarchy. Consider the attitude toward Anwar Sadat himself. Doesn't that make it much harder to end the delusion? This is wonderful. This is a wonderful question. And I've been to Egypt about 16 times. And we do have people in Egypt who reject the idea of being Africans. And they are correct because they are basically Arabs. So that's the bottom line of it. Part of it is, again, is like white Americans coming to North America and rejecting the idea of being called Apache. I mean, they are from somewhere else. And even though they are living on the land of the Apache or the Cherokee. So that's what has happened in Egypt to a large extent, that the people who dominate Egypt today in a contemporary sense are people who came from Arabia. They came from Arabia in the 7th century. And they came actually as to support. Originally, they were asked to come by the Africans. The Africans asked them to come to help them throw off the Romans. And when they came into Africa from Arabia, General Az, who was the Arab leader, came in and helped the Africans get rid of the Romans, and then decided to make his own conquest of the Nile Valley. And that opened up the gateway for many Arabs to come into Egypt. So now you got Arabs in Egypt, many of them claiming not to be Africans. So when I'm in Egypt, of course, I go to the Black villages. The Black villages have been there for thousands of years. They're still there. And in fact, the island of Elephantine is 3,000 people, and 90% of them are Black, and there are no Arabs that I know of who live in Elephantine. So there are many anomalies, I mean, many things there in Kemet, but this idea of Africans, or rather Arabs not claiming to be Africans, that is correct, and that is true. However, that doesn't matter to those of us who know the history, because we know, yes, it is true that the Arabs did not build the pyramids. The Arabs did not build the city of Waset or the temple of Karnak, or the city that they renamed Luxor. That city was not built by the Arabs, you see. Much like the Greeks who had intruded Egypt before the Arabs, the Greeks named Waset, this great city of Waset, they named it Thebes. And then when the Arabs came in, they named it Luxor. So, but the base is all African, and it's all there. And I have friends there, and who are Africans. So I know that Egypt, much like Libya, were black places, black countries long before they were Arabs. So that's one question. Then there was another question had to do with how do we help people who are so attached to Christianity, unafraid to get rid of it, and Jesus. Well, I think if you get rid of religion, it won't hurt you. I've never known anybody to be hurt by getting rid of Islam or Christianity or Judaism. That's not a danger. I mean, there's nothing going to happen to you that wouldn't have happened to you anyway. So I think that really, to be honest with you, I think that at the root of white supremacy is religion. And I think that, or at least if you look at the Hindu religion, for example, with the creation of the varnas, the so-called castes, from the lighter complexion to the darker complexion, is a racial ladder as well. And that was created by the Indo-Aryans invading India and creating this situation. And then, of course, even with Judaism, you get this whole question about the children of Ham and so on, and the hewers of wood and the carriers of water and all that kind of thing, or the doctrines of Islam with the heathens or the people who are slaves as abd, the word abd, abdel, abdul, and so forth. All these things are hidden in the religion. And if people believe in those doctrines, in Christianity, servants obey your masters, whatever. If you believe in all of that, then of course it has an impact on your brain. Fortunately, I've spent years releasing myself from all those kinds of attachments, because it doesn't help you. It doesn't mean you're more successful, or it doesn't mean that you are you're going to advance further. The only way we advance in terms of our humanity is to live as the ancient African people understood, to live a life of ma'at, to look for balance and harmony, to look for truth and righteousness, to be fair, to take care of yourself and be kind to other people. That's the basis. Beyond that, what else is there to know in terms of values, you see? So that's the way I respond to that question. And then someone else asked another question.
Dr. Asante,
yes.
You have one. Can Dr. Asante explain critical race theory?
Yes, I can. Okay, that's okay. Yes, critical race theory actually is a philosophy or a system of thinking that was proposed by legal scholars, African-American legal scholars, who studying the law, teaching the law in law school. They are there, and as they're looking at racial discrimination, they see that racial discrimination in the law, it does not just affect a particular situation. It's in all the systems. It's in the corporate world. It's in the religious world. It's in the educational world. It's everywhere. America breathes. The breath of America is this racism. So the critical race theory says, you know what? So we can't just look at race in a separate way. We have to look at race and class, race and sexuality, race and gender, and so forth and so on. So this is where they came up with the doctrine of intersectionality. And these were people like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, and there's several other strong African-American theorists, philosophers of law, who have said that in order to look at this question of race, you got to look at all the intersections with race. I mean, in terms of work and jobs and religion, all this stuff interacts. You see, it's a whole system. And so that's one thing, but that's totally different from what the reactionaries are doing. The reactionaries are really responding to what they believe is a critique of white supremacy. And that's their response. So anytime you critique white supremacy, they will holler critical race theory. I don't want them to be teaching my children that white people killed the Indians. Well, they did. So let's deal with it. Let's deal with it. You know, there may not be any answers that would be satisfactory to people, but people must know the truth. Things happen, and they did happen. It's a historical fact. So if we did this, if you can say, if you guys did this, what kind of repayment now is necessary? And that's why what Joe Biden did with the so-called Indian tribal territories and leaders recently, by saying we're going to do what we can to stand these people up, to repay them for the fact we took a whole continent from them. That's correct to do. But it's not correct to say we didn't do anything to them, we just killed them. And we don't want anybody to don't raise any questions about the fact that we killed them. No, you can't do that. But that's what, when they say critical race theory, when you hear someone say, I don't want my children to learn critical race theory, what they're saying, I don't want my children to learn that the Alamo was really about white people protecting slavery. They don't want their children to learn that, you see? So any books that say, well, Stephen Austin was really trying to get territory to raise cotton and to enslave the Africans, bring them over into Mexico, no, they don't want that. Of course, and of course, America took, as I said earlier, half of Mexico's territory away from it. Okay.
Thank you for that, Dr. Asante. In the Q&A, Alex asked, thank you so much for the great talk. How do you distinguish and engender Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism in your teaching and lived experience?
Well, Pan-Africanism and what was the other question?
Afrocentricity.
Oh, okay. Afrocentricity is a theory that asserts that African people must view themselves as subjects of human historical narratives rather than being on the margins of Europe, that we interpret things from the standpoint of our own agency, our own action as people. And we say that Pan-Africanism is the doctrine that all African people and all African nations ought to be united. For example, there should be one continental Africa, and that you should have one passport which says Africa, that you wouldn't have to get a visa to go from one African nation to another, that there should be one currency, maybe the Afro, that there should be an official language, of Africa, and that all African people who have been spread around the globe because of enslavement and domination and oppression should be allowed to return to the continent of Africa and and have African rights and responsibilities. This is Pan-Africanism. But we argue that in order for Afrocentric, and I argued this in my book last year, the Afrocentric Pan-Africanist vision, the book is called The Afrocentric Pan-Africanist Vision, is that in order for Pan-Africanism to exist and to be fruitful and energetic and to invigorate the African world, it has to have an Afrocentric base. In other words, Afrocentricity, or rather Pan-Africanism without Afrocentricity is a slogan. But in order to overcome the sloganizing by saying I'm for Pan-Africanism, you have to say I'm for an Afrocentric Pan-Africanism. And that way that allows us to use Afrocentricity as an organizing principle for Pan-Africanism. I see there is also a question from an old friend of mine from Paris, Mutu, So I'm glad to see he's on here. He says, thanks for your wonderful, what can Africans do to de-Europeanize or de-Arabize their spirituality and their minds? And I think this is a good question, Brother Mutu. We've tried everything we can. Well, part of it is, number one, to interrogate our own spiritual traditions. See, before you go trying to practice somebody else's spirituality, ask yourself, what did our people do? And the reason we don't ask ourselves, what did our people do? Or how did our people do it? The reason we don't ask these questions is because Europe has so inferiorized Africa in our own minds that we don't want to be identified with that, because they've said we were heathens, we were savages, we didn't know this, we were primitive. And so we never want to ask those questions. But I had a beautiful experience a few years ago. One of my students who had studied with me for a year, she decided that she wanted to go home to Nigeria. And when she went home, she did something that her mother did not expect. She said to her mother, "Mother, I want to know, where is our family shrine? Where is the sacred place of our people? I want to go there." And she said her mother broke down and cried. And the mother later explained to her, "You know why I cried? I cried because you had gone away to, she'd been educated in Switzerland and in the United States. And so I just knew that when you came back home, you would have nothing to do with our culture and you would just, have gone into the European world. But now you come back and you ask for yourself. You ask, where is the place that our people see as sacred?" And the mother had taken her there and just broke down. It was powerful. It's the most powerful thing, because what has happened to most of us is that we've lost our minds. But the only way to regain our minds is to de-Arabize ourselves and to de-Europeanize ourselves by at least attaching ourselves to what we know. And I don't even tell people, you don't have to, people don't say you got to practice Catholicism the same way they practiced it in the 12th century. People don't say you practice Islam the way they practiced it in the 14th century. They say, you know what? If you're going to look at your African tradition, hey, there are ways you can look at it. There are all kinds of things you don't have to accept in any religion, in any quest. If you're religious, you make these choices. So part of the choice, though, is to make the choice for yourself, because there are no chosen people in the world except the self-choosing people. If you choose yourself, you are a chosen person. If you don't choose yourself, then somebody else is chosen. Thank you very much. Ms. Wilson, I guess I'm only here. Thank you.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr.
No,
Asante.
I just want to say thank you very much for a wonderful session. Appreciate it.
And for all of the other questions that you have in there, you'll respond separately?
I don't know. Are there questions or a couple of questions I
Yes,
can answer?
you have
Okay.
several questions. You have one. Dr. Anderson writes, Joe noted we Africans need to be interconnected. What are some of the challenges to this goal?
Well, some of the challenges to the goal of us being interconnected is knowledge. I mean, the first one is knowledge. We just don't know. I mean, I'm tremendously surprised by the fact that, for example, we are not aware of each other's information. And when Thomas Sankara was president of Burkina Faso, he organized something that was called the Institute of the Black People, the Peuple Noir. And I was invited to this meeting along with several other of my colleagues and peers. And we went to Burkina Faso, to Ouagadougou for this. He had been killed, unfortunately, a few months earlier. And but they still had this meeting. And the Institute of the Black Peoples was sponsored by UNESCO. And its purpose was to have one place where information about the African world could be disseminated in many languages. For example, if the people in Brazil, you got 100 million Black people who live in Brazil. If those 100 million Black people who live in Brazil and who basically speak Portuguese, if those Black people wrote something, it ought to be sent then to the Institute in Ouagadougou, translated into other languages and disseminated to the rest of the Black world. If people wrote something in English, sent to Ouagadougou, translated into other languages and sent to the rest of the world. This was the idea that Thomas Sankara had. And unfortunately, truly unfortunately, after his death, the organization wasn't able to survive. But it was the dream. So part of it is, and what he wanted to do, if Black people are living, for example, we had a student to do a dissertation here at Temple on Afro-Mexicans. And she discovered that there are more than 200 villages, predominantly Black villages in Mexico. So, but if you don't know that there are 200 Black villages in Mexico, over 200 Black villages in Mexico, and you live in Colombia, which is further south, you skip over Mexico coming to the United States because you've heard of the Black people in the United States, largely because of the political power and economic power of the United States of America itself. That's why you've heard of the 40 million Blacks here, but there are just about 40 million Black people who live in Colombia. And there are also, as I said, 100 million Black people who live in Brazil. So part of this, we don't know each other. And the Black people who are living in Europe, I mean, in Germany, in France, in Russia. When I went to Russia, in last February 2020, February 2020, I go to Moscow, and lo and behold, one of the first people I meet is a Black person, at the hotel. Second thing is that I go to the university, and there are all these Black students from all over Africa, because the university I was at has a student from every country in Africa. They deliberately did this. They said, if we don't have a student from Botswana, we send somebody there to recruit a student, and we bring them to the university, we pay their tuition. So every country in Africa is represented at Rudin in Moscow. And this was so I meet these African people in Moscow, and I say, wow, they don't know about the African people in Germany. They don't know about the African people who are in France and so forth. So all of this has to happen, but we will get there. But that's part of the interconnection. And I think that Dr. Anderson, who asked that question, who is one of the leading experts on Afrofuturism, contemporary Afrofuturism, he's doing a big job himself in bringing us together. And I really appreciate that.
Do you have time for one more?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So Charlotte, I can't see her last name. She asked, how do you help people who are so attached to Christianity and are afraid to let go of it and Jesus?
Well, you keep working with people. You see, Christianity was forced upon us. It was not even our choice. We didn't choose it. We didn't choose Islam. They were forced on us through the gun and through threats. And African people were enslaved by both Muslims and Christians. I ask myself, I don't even understand it. I don't understand how Black people can be either. That's just I don't understand it. I'm not saying it's not understand. I'm sure somebody can make sense of it. I can't understand it. How in the world can you take on the concept of God? Because the concept of God that was given to you by your slave master. How can you, people who think of you as savages and primitive, no, you can't do this. That is the problem. But what it is that I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I can only use myself as an example, and that is that I read myself out of it. I thought myself out of it. And so when Louis Farrakhan told me when I was a student at UCLA, young man, because you're so eloquent and you speak so well, the nation needs you. I went to the nation once and I said, well, but from what I can tell, the nation doesn't need me and I don't need the nation. The same is with Christianity. I said, you know what? From what I can tell, they don't need me and I don't need them. Because my goodness comes from the fact that being a human being and being a human being who believes that if you are good and kind to other people and you take care of yourself, what else is there? You take care of your children, what else is there? You know, that's my thing. So I know it's tough because people, I think part of it is fear. And I think what the fear is the fear of dying, but we're all going to die. So I don't have that fear. I think that that is, I mean, the thing is that if that's the thing, then you have to overcome that. And maybe people don't ever overcome it. But for me, I think that that's not a issue. I'm willing to live fully.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. Dr.
Thank you
Asante,
very much.
you have one person who's had her hand raised, Angelina Graham. Can I allow her to speak?
Sure, please.
Angelina, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay.
Did she go? All right.
All right. And how about Lahasa Malloy?
Lahasa is here. Oh, Malloy. Oh yeah. Let me speak to Lahasa.
Can you unmute yourself?
Lahasa, are you there? Lahasa. The reason I want to speak to Lahasa is because I do owe him a letter and so on, and I want him to know that I'll take care of it.
So this is Angelina. Can you hear me?
Angelina, yes, I can.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting to be called.
That's all right.
So first of all, I'm always enchanted. I don't have enough words to give you to appreciate that you guys continued this series online. And the story that you shared with us about your student who went home to Nigeria and spoke with her mother about the shrine, that really hit me. And I've been to Africa 4 times myself. I went to Ghana, and I felt similar when I went to the slave dungeons. I don't call them castles.
Yes, yes.
And I felt like I had hit the shrine. Yes. And I didn't have that language though, so I really appreciate it. I'm a womanist by scholarship, and I'd like to use that terminology in the title of my dissertation. And I just wanted to ask, I know you probably would never see it and never know about it, but yeah, it's very significant that we find our shrines.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And I've been to those dungeons myself, and I know precisely what you're feeling. And I've walked through them maybe 10 times, and every time I feel the same sense of the spirit of the Africans. You know what we Angelina, what we do when I've gone and I've led many groups to them. Whether they're in the one in Senegal, you can go to the one in Senegal, Gorée, or the one Elmina and Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. They're the ones that are popular. But you go and you curse the door of no return. I go and we curse the door of no return. We said we left through these doors, and they call you the door of no return. But look at us, we are back. Okay?
Yes, sir.
So the next time you go, that's what you do. You go, you say, we went through these doors, but we're back.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. So Lahasa, Dr. Malone.
Yes, Prof. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you clearly, and I want you to know that I owe you something. I will write to you.
Prof and the rest of the colleagues that are listening, I'm down here in South Africa. The fire of Afrocentricity continues to provoke conversations that are eternal. I remember very well as I had lunch with you in Temple, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when you said to me, as much as you have come to love Afrocentricity, but it will be incomplete until you go down back to the civilization of the Nile Valley. Looking into the triple heritage written by Ali Mazrui, I saw part of his writing, he was somehow conflicted about your point that sought to resist Arab pile up on top of African ancestors. And in a way, in the 15th centuries, when Europeans then invaded Africa, we had the East and the West on top of African ancestors. And coming from the evangelical colonial background of having been a Baptist preacher, I had a time with you in which you shared to me a poem that if you were an African dictator, what would you do? You spoke to the subject of raising the African shrines. That speaks to the fact that we have turned away from our ancestors. And I do believe that even those who engage theologically must help us to redefine God from the Afrocentric perspective, which is the fall of the European God as a hold that has actually crept us. And I believe that once we pass through that ceiling, African people will basically begin to resurrect. I've basically started a work with school children in which I'm beginning through the work of Dr. Noah Dove and your work on Afrocentric blueprint that is about the time for the sons and the daughters of the soil to begin to awaken. And after 3 years working through my PhD, I'm beginning to feel that I'm ready to resurrect a temple of Afrocentricity within the University of South Africa. And I'm eternally indebted and very grateful for the work that you've worked and the indelible mark that you've definitely worked in my heart. And I believe that unfortunately, many people are still trapped within the Hegelian narrative of Africa. But I believe that once we break through the Euro narratives of a God which have metaphysically captured us, African people will begin to be liberated. And thank you very much. And I want you to know that whether you are here in flesh or in spirit absent from us, we are taking this fire to the world and we are running with it. And thank you very much for what the Temple University of Ecology have done for us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Molefi. Dr. Molefi is one of the outstanding Afrocentrists in South Africa. He's a great brother of mine, younger brother of mine. I'm devoted and dedicated to his work as well. He and brother Asante in South Africa and the brothers and sisters at several of the universities are doing very strong and powerful work. And and Dr. Molefi, his book will soon be coming out, hopefully, of either Routledge or Anthem Press. He has written a very powerful work. So thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate the fact that you have come and you attended. Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson, for being our hostess. Peace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asante, and thank you for attending. You can view any of our webinars through our YouTube channel, and please don't forget to subscribe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.